Debbie Leitch was a vulnerable young woman with Down syndrome, who despite her disability, lived life to the fullest. She loved others deeply, and she desperately wanted the same in return. Instead of being protected, she was neglected and starved to death by a demon of a mother, Elaine Clarke, and when her body was discovered in her home in the town of Blackpool on the 29th of August 2019, this 24-year-old woman weighed less than 4 stone, or 56 pounds, and was found in a room infested with maggots and covered in her own waste. This is a case of a vulnerable woman who was invisible and forgotten by agencies who suffered a truly horrific death. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Deborah Ann Leitch, known as Debbie, was born in January 1995 in Hastings, a seaside town in East Sussex, on the south coast of England. She was the daughter of Elaine Clarke and Tom Leitch, and she had 2 sisters called Katie and Courtney, and a brother called Tyler. Debbie had Down syndrome, a genetic condition which is usually associated with some sort of learning disability. However, this is on a continuum, and many people with Down syndrome, with support, are able to live independently, have jobs, and live fulfilled, happy lives. Although Debbie had quite a significant learning disability and was dependent on those around her to meet all of her basic needs, it's important front and centre to state that she never felt sorry for herself. She never let her difficulties get in the way of her life. Debbie was described as a beautiful soul, someone who was always smiling, who loved nothing more than being the centre of attention and brushing her hair in the mirror. Her father Tom later spoke about how Debbie's face would light up whenever she saw him. Debbie was also described as shy around new people, but when she got to know someone, they had a friend for life. She was a pure and innocent soul. Tom and Debbie had a close relationship, but there was no affection from her mother Elaine, despite the fact that Debbie is reported to have idolised her. Elaine Clarke is a woman who's incapable of showing love to anyone else but herself. She's a depraved, selfish, narcissistic monster who has never deserved to call herself a mother. Elaine Clarke was born around 1973 and grew up in Hastings. Little has been published about her upbringing, but it was apparently horrific, with her mother having significant health issues and her father being a monster of a man who would beat all the members of the family. However, this difficult upbringing is no excuse for what she went on to do. As already stated, Elaine eventually had 4 children, including Debbie, and all of them had some sort of mental or physical disability. However, Elaine was not interested in raising the children. She was interested in the money they brought in. She got an enhanced level of benefits payment and carer's allowance for each of the children. This she would never spend on them, always on herself. A family member later stated, quote, "Elaine has always been a lazy and selfish mother. She would buy handbags and shoes, but would not get out of bed." Despite this, on her Facebook page, this narcissistic and evil woman described herself as, quote, "I'm very friendly, honest, true person, will help out anyone, the most loyal and trustworthy." All of the children were known to social services and were all on child protection plans at some point, i.e. there were significant concerns about them coming to serious harm, and this always stemmed from Elaine not meeting their basic needs, not feeding them, not washing them. With regards to Debbie specifically, when she went to school, she frequently had head lice and would be wearing ill-fitting and smelly clothes, and she often never had a packed lunch, meaning other children would give her theirs so she didn't go hungry. Elaine was a master at deception. She would tie professionals in knots. She would miss appointments, call up apologetic afterwards, reading off excuses, and eagerly rearrange, only to not show up. When she was finally forced into a corner, she would actually get off her ass and tidy up and do the bare minimum to present a false perception that she gave a shit, which would keep social services off her back for a bit longer. Her complete lack of empathy and care for her own children made the next decision even more ridiculous. After Tom and Elaine split up in 1997, she was given full custody of all 4 children. Tom later explained that he contested this decision, but at the time, he said there was a presumption by the courts that children were best off with their mother, regardless of whether they were actually fit to use this term. Tom had regular contact with Debbie after the separation, but this all changed in 2014 when Elaine took the children and moved to Leeds, a city in West Yorkshire, over 250 miles away, where she went to live with her new boyfriend, a man called Robert Bruce. Tom later said that Elaine essentially blocked him from talking to or spending time with Debbie, and for the last 5 years of her life, it appears he had almost no contact with his daughter. Initially, after the move to Leeds, Debbie was happy and had a full life. She was 19 years old and she attended daycare, which provided her with a range of activities. She went to college, she made friends, and even had a boyfriend. But it seems this was all about keeping up appearances, Elaine projecting the illusion that she cared about anyone but herself. However, everything changed in August 2016 when Elaine Clarke, Robert Bruce, Debbie Leitch, and the other 3 children moved to a property in Garden Terrace in the town of Blackpool, 80 miles away. For some reason, which I'll come back to later, Elaine saw no reason to pretend anymore, and from the moment that she moved into the property, Debbie had no quality of life, and over the next 3 years, she would be isolated, terrified, and constantly hungry, before dying completely alone. One thing I do need to mention is that whilst I solely discuss Elaine's abuse of Debbie, there was another adult in the house, Robert Bruce. I don't know anything about him, but his name will come up again later. He was front and centre to everything I'm about to mention, but did absolutely nothing, and in my opinion, is just as twisted as Elaine. Anyway, after moving to Blackpool, Elaine didn't bother to register Debbie with the local adult social services team or the adult community learning disability team. Both agencies help people with Down syndrome lead a full life, including giving them regular health checks and providing them with activities to enjoy. So Debbie went from going to college, having friends, having trips she could go on, to doing absolutely nothing. It's likely that for the last 3 years of her life, Debbie was in the house most of the time, cut off from the outside world. It's clear that Debbie was neglected by her evil mother from day one, but the first signs were officially documented in April 2018, when she was referred to Clifton Hospital in St Anne's with a scabies skin infection. Scabies is a contagious condition where microscopic mites burrow into the skin. It can cause extreme itching and discomfort. Debbie was found to be suffering from Norwegian scabies, a severe form of infestation, where a person, rather than having tens of mites on their body, can have millions, and this can cause severe pain, cracking of the skin, and lesions developing. Despite how severe it is, the condition is easily treatable, but Elaine didn't bother to get the medication her daughter needed and missed follow-up GP appointments. In May 2018, Elaine Clarke asked for an assessment from the Adult Community Learning Disability team to allow Debbie to access activities, but she failed to attend multiple meetings to discuss this, and the file was closed. This was clearly just so she could say, "Look, I did call, but nothing happened. It's everyone else's fault." In the autumn of that same year, Children's Social Services visited Garden Terrace to check on the other children, and they were horrified by the living conditions. There were dirty nappies everywhere, and the property stunk of human waste. They saw Debbie, who looked noticeably unwell, and it was clear that her scabies was getting worse, and her skin had a thick crust on it. Elaine then jumped into action and claimed that she would make sure Debbie was looked after and had things to do, and so she made another referral for Debbie to access activities. But of course, once the heat was off, she never followed through with this. It wasn't just Debbie who lived in absolute squalor, but also her siblings. Elaine's son Tyler had daily carers from a company called Cherish UK, and 2 of these later gave statements about the disgusting conditions in the home. One former carer said that the house always smells of feces, and there were, quote, always stacks of dirty pots in the kitchen. The other carer stated that he found bottles of urine in the house. Both carers later confirmed that they would often hear crying coming from Debbie's room, where she was forced to sleep on a disgusting mattress on the floor, but neither bothered to check on her, and when they did ask Elaine, She simply said that Debbie had been naughty, or was having a tantrum, or was just attention seeking. One of the workers actually saw Debbie towards the end of her life and later said that she looked like a skeleton. Sickeningly, neither of these supposed carers raised any alarms. Their rationale: they were there to look after Elaine's son and so appeared indifferent to what else might be going on in the home. This organisation, justifiably, came in for a lot of criticism after Debbie's death. It's likely that Debbie spent all day in her room alone. Despite the fact that she was in her 20s, she'd lost control of her bowels, likely due to the trauma, and she was forced to wear nappies, and when these were used, they were simply stacked up in the room around her. She was also surrounded by bags containing her own soiled clothes, and slept on a mattress soaked with her own urine and feces. On the rare occasions she ate, it was takeaways, and boxes containing rotten remnants of fast food were scattered all over the room. During 2019, family members and friends visited the home, and they noticed a clear deterioration in Debbie's condition. In April 2019, relatives came round, including Elaine's niece, a woman called Sammy Mugridge. The family asked where Debbie was, and they were told that she didn't want to come out of her room. Sammy ignored this and went looking for Debbie, and what she found was shocking. Debbie was lying in the dark, huddled on a sodden mattress. There were dirty nappies all around her, and the room stank. With encouragement, Debbie came out of the room, but she was having difficulty walking. In the light, Sammy could see that Debbie's pyjamas were heavily stained and looked rotten. Debbie still had scabies, a condition which, with proper treatment, can be cleared up in a matter of weeks, but she'd had this for over a year, and her skin was sore, covered in a thick crust, and with obvious lesions. At this point, Debbie started crying, calling out for her mother. And this is a truly horrific part of this case. Despite how poorly her mother was treating her, Debbie just wanted her, for her to love her, to comfort her. This was not the last time this happened. In Debbie's final hours, she was again heard crying out for her mummy. Sammy and other relatives gave Elaine 2 weeks to sort out the situation, or they were reported to the authorities. At the end of this time, Elaine contacted her relatives and assured them that Debbie was showered, dressed, and was now eating well. This cannot possibly have been confirmed because it was all a lie. Debbie was becoming sicker and sicker. Her body was shutting down. Neighbours would often hear a female voice, Debbie's voice, crying out, "Mummy, Mummy." And as time progressed, this became weaker and weaker. When these neighbours confronted Elaine, she simply said her daughter was sick. Things came to a head on the 26th of July 2019, just a month before Debbie died, when Elaine threw a family birthday for her son Tyler, and Debbie was not there. Again, Elaine's cousin, Sammy Mugridge, was present, and she, along with other relatives, were told that Debbie didn't want to come out of her room or to see them. Undeterred, Sammy and others went into the room and found Debbie in an even worse condition than before. Debbie was essentially skin and bones, with her rotten clothes hanging off her. She was surrounded by rotting food and dirty nappies. Debbie's hair was now short, having either fallen out or been hacked off. Her skin was covered with scabs and sores, and Debbie was clearly in agony. She was found to be wearing a days-old nappy, which was leaking, so her legs were covered in around waist. Sammy later said, quote, "I'll never forget the last day I saw Debbie alive. I knew she was ill and not well, but the sight of her in the room will live with me forever. The stench was unbearable. I can only describe it as the stench of death." When confronted, it was later said that Elaine Clarke showed no emotion. She simply did not care. Immediately after this, the family contacted social services in Blackpool, and a safeguarding alert was later forwarded to the Waterloo medical practice. Elaine knew she had to do something, and so she dragged her sick, her dying daughter into the bathroom and gave her her first shower for what was likely months, scrubbing her skin, causing Debbie to cry out in pain, and she was again crying out for her mummy. The social worker from Adult Safeguarding attended the property on the 29th of July 2019 as part of an unannounced visit, but they were refused entry to the house by one of the other children. Elaine then called to apologise, saying that Debbie was sick. An arrangement was made for the social worker to return on the 1st of August, 3 days later. Elaine was buying time. During these few days, she was tidying the house, getting rid of soiled clothing and nappies, and inevitably manipulating her disabled 24-year-old daughter into staying silent, likely using the love that Debbie had for her against her. You don't want to tell these nasty people anything. They'll put Mummy in jail. When the social worker came round, Debbie had been dressed in baggy clothing in an attempt to make her seem larger than she was and to hide her injuries. She sat gaunt and uncommunicative next to her mother. The social worker failed spectacularly to ask any questions. They didn't ask why Debbie was wearing nappies. They didn't ask why she appeared so unwell. They questioned Debbie in front of her abuser, and of course, she said nothing. The social worker concluded there was no imminent risk to Debbie, and they scheduled another visit for the 2nd of September 2019. By this point, Debbie would be dead. It wasn't just this social worker who failed in their safeguarding duty. Around the same time, a doctor from Waterloo Medical Practice came to the property. Again, Debbie was sat in front of him in oversized clothes. He asked no questions and didn't examine Debbie. He simply spoke to Elaine and after a short time left, concluding that whilst Debbie seemed underweight, she was not at risk of imminent harm. These were the last opportunities to save Debbie Leitch's life. As August 2019 drew on, she became weaker and weaker. She must have spent her last days in agony. She must have been so scared. Neighbours reported hearing a shrill woman's voice, repeating "Mummy, Mummy," over and over again in those last few days, but no one responded. No one came to comfort Debbie. She was alone. At around 10:40 p.m. on Thursday the 29th of August 2019, Elaine Clarke called the emergency services, stating that her 24-year-old daughter Debbie had been ill for a few days. She hadn't been eating or drinking, and she was now cold to the touch. Elaine said that she believed Debbie had passed away. I want to play you a short clip of what the first paramedic on the scene saw.
Yeah, I don't think anyone who was in this coroner's court today hearing those details could be anything other than distressed, so it bears repeating. What I'm about to tell you does make for very uncomfortable listening. The inquest heard from the paramedic who was first on the scene at Debbie Leitch's house that day, called out, he thought, to a woman who had gone into cardiac arrest. The court was told that when he went into Debbie's bedroom, it was covered in her own waste. It was on the floor, it was on the bed, it was on the walls. He said it was clear that she had been dead for some time, was seriously neglected. And he said her body was so emaciated and her skin so damaged by an infection caused by mites called scabies that he couldn't tell whether she was female or not.
Debbie's room was also infested with maggots. She had died in squalor, all on her own. When Elaine spoke to the paramedics, she claimed that her daughter had died at around 8 p.m, just under 3 hours before the 999 call was made. However, a pathologist later stated that Debbie had been dead for at least 8 hours, and potentially for as long as 3 days, before she was discovered. At her autopsy, Debbie was found to weigh just 3 stone 10, or 52 pounds. Her face was completely encrusted with scabs and thickened skin, making her unrecognisable. Her hair was falling out, and the scabies mites had been allowed to multiply and fester over every part of her body. Her cause of death was determined to be emaciation and neglect, with extensive and severe scabies skin infection. It appears that Elaine Clarke was arrested soon after the death of Debbie, but was released on bail whilst the police investigated, and their investigation took almost 2 years. During this time, Elaine could not even pretend to care, and she did 2 horrific things which just epitomise her level of callousness and evil. Firstly, instead of calling Debbie's father Tom Leitch, she posted about their daughter's death on Facebook. This is the first he knew about it. He had to contact police in Blackpool to find out if this was true. Also, Tom tried to take control of Debbie's funeral, but it was too late. Elaine had already disposed of their daughter. She had pleaded poverty, and so the tab for the service was picked up by the local council, and Debbie had what used to be known as a pauper's funeral. A cheap coffin, a service attended by almost no one, and then she was cremated. Tom did eventually get half of Debbie's ashes and buried them next to his father, Debbie's grandfather. Elaine was not the only person arrested. Her partner Robert Bruce was also detained, along with 4 other people, although these latter individuals were released without charge. Eventually, in March 2021, a year and a half after Debbie's death, Elaine Clarke was charged with gross negligence manslaughter, which is an offence in the UK where a person causes a death through some negligent act, in this case, essentially allowing Debbie Leitch to starve to death. In my opinion, this should have been murder. Robert Bruce was also charged with the same offence, as well as allowing or causing the death of a vulnerable adult, i.e. he knew exactly what was going on, but did nothing. They then awaited their day in court. Elaine Clarke and Robert Bruce pleaded not guilty to all charges at their first appearance at Preston Crown Court on the 19th of May 2021. A trial date was set for the 31st of January 2022, and both were bailed. This is what had happened all through the case. Both Elaine and Robert were allowed to remain in the community and enjoy their lives, whilst they'd stolen Debbie's future away from her. Sickeningly, it appears that all charges were dropped against Robert. Why is not clear, but this is utterly ridiculous. He saw everything and did nothing, but apparently walked away scot-free. So Elaine was left to face the music alone, and 10 days before her trial was due to start, she pleaded guilty to gross negligence manslaughter, essentially admitting that she'd caused the death of her daughter Debbie Leitch. This had nothing to do with remorse. This was about knowing the writing was on the wall and trying to get a reduced sentence. On Thursday the 24th of February 2022, Elaine Clarke was back in court before Mrs. Justice Yip for sentencing. At no point did she show any remorse. She didn't shed one tear for Debbie. Elaine had had a pre-sentence report completed by probation in which she claimed that she'd done her best as a mother. Justice Yip referenced this directly in her sentencing remarks, stating, quote, "You may be in denial to yourself as much as to others, but you cannot pretend that this is true. The condition in which Debbie was found shows that not only did you not do your best, but you must have done absolutely nothing to care for her the last days of her life. Instead, you simply abandoned her to die alone, in pain, without nourishment, and in the most awful physical surroundings." She continued, "During the last month, there's ample evidence from the statements of the carers and the neighbours together with her condition at death that Debbie experienced real suffering. Nothing was done to halt her decline. Debbie was starved. Her scabies was allowed to run out of control. She became more and more weakened until she died. In her last days, she was denied even the most basic care and dignity. Anyone entering her room and seeing her towards the end of her life could have been left with no doubt that her life was in real danger. One way or another, you ignored that risk and left Debbie to die in her squalid room." She then sentenced her. For neglecting and starving her own daughter to death, 49-year-old Elaine Clarke was sentenced to just 9 years and 7 months in prison. She was directed to serve 2/3 of this term in custody before being considered for release, meaning she'll be able to apply for parole as early as May 2028. The sentence was appalling. Debbie's father Tom summed it up best by saying, quote, "Is that all my daughter's life was worth?" A review commissioned by the Blackpool Safeguarding Adults Board following Elaine Clarke's sentencing began in March 2022, and in April 2023 the report was published. This included that Debbie had been utterly failed by professionals, which meant that she'd been left, quote, "unsupported, invisible, and isolated." Particular criticism was levelled at the social worker and doctor who last had contact with Debbie when she was clearly dying but saw no risk. The same with carers from Cherish UK, who knew what was going on, but did nothing. The report cited how professionals had been easily manipulated by Elaine. They lacked professional curiosity. Not one of them actually spoke to Debbie on her own, giving her an opportunity to voice how scared she was, how unwell she felt, outside the presence of her abuser. The report determined that Debbie Leitch had been, quote, failed, and unless the learning of this review is used to develop practice, the same outcome could befall other adults at risk. Of course, in the aftermath, various agencies released statements of remorse and stated they would do better. All of this is just words. Nothing will bring back Debbie, the beautiful, kind young woman who desperately wanted to be loved, who should have always been loved and protected, but who was left to die scared and alone. There's almost no information about Elaine Clarke, but I think we can make some solid assumptions. Primarily, that she's a truly evil, self-absorbed and callous woman. Someone who was happy to have child after child, but couldn't care less about them after they were born. Children to Elaine were just paychecks, a way to rinse the benefit system for all it was worth, to buy herself trinkets to wear, to try and hide the ugliness beneath. After the split with Tom, I've no doubt that Debbie became a tool to manipulate him. She could have easily been left to live with her father, but no, she was dragged across the country, and his access to her was essentially severed. This was to hurt him. If this caused Debbie distress, so be it. But now she was stuck with a daughter she didn't love, who she had no ability or willingness to care for. Debbie did have a decent life initially when the family moved to Leeds, but this was clearly because it benefited Elaine. Possibly social services were hovering. Maybe people were questioning where the money she was being paid to care for Debbie was going. Regardless, she kept up appearances until when they moved to Blackpool, there seemed to be no professional oversight, no one was watching, no one could see what she was doing, and so she neglected her vulnerable daughter. There's more to this than just simple neglect in my opinion. This was sadistic. All of Elaine's children appear to have difficulties, but Debbie was singled out for the worst abuse. From what I've read, Debbie, due to having Down syndrome, had the most profound issues. I think this angered Elaine. I imagine that Debbie simply wanted attention, wanted a cuddle, called out for her mummy, and Elaine despised this. She despised this creature being in her life, despite the fact it was her who had caused this to happen. Clearly, the other children were treated very differently, including her son Tyler having a family birthday party, whilst Debbie shivered in her room. I think potentially, as Debbie had Down syndrome, Elaine saw her as less than human, and she enjoyed tormenting her. As I said, Debbie, despite the abuse she was experiencing, kept calling out for her mother. Instead of Elaine seeing this as a young woman who just so desperately wanted to be loved, she likely saw it as hilarious that she could abuse this vulnerable young woman and she would still keep wanting approval. Debbie died over a number of days, and Elaine could not have failed to notice this. I imagine she stood, watching the life drain out of her daughter, and felt nothing. No emotion, no regret, no remorse. As a final indignity to her daughter, Elaine couldn't even be bothered to put her hands in her pocket to bury Debbie. She forced this on the local authority, and she was given the most basic funeral. Elaine likely looked at the cost, thought of it in terms of handbags and shoes, and went, nah, she's not worth it. I have a particular hatred for those who abuse the vulnerable. People with Down syndrome are some of the purest I've ever met. They're so unpretentious, so full of love and happiness, and Elaine Clarke took this and abused it utterly. She betrayed the trust of a young woman who should have been protected at all costs. Debbie died a horrific death, and the fact that the woman who killed her, who in my eyes murdered her, might be out in just 3 years' time is ridiculous. I hope that Elaine Clarke has a miserable life, shunned by everyone, and eventually suffers the same fate as her daughter, dying alone, forgotten by the world. So, what are your thoughts on this case? If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, and you can also send a one-off donation to support the channel using the thanks button. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.